Hi, everybody. We are live on Fireside today. I am so excited. I'm Dr. Amy Robbins, and welcome to Life, Death, and the Space Between podcast. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist and medium, and here we explore life, death, consciousness, and what it all means. I am so excited for today's show because it really feels in so many ways like the merger of everything that I think about in my life. And here it is for you all to hear about. So today I have Al Powers and Brittany Quagan on the show. Al is a psychiatrist and neuroscientist who is passionate about understanding human experience and building bridges to help us empathize with each other's experiences. The way he chooses to build these bridges is by viewing experiences like hearing or seeing things other people don't on the same spectrum with everyday perceptual experiences. He believes that by understanding perception, we can begin to help normalize experiences and decrease the stigma and dysfunction they sometimes carry. Dr. Powers has an MD, PhD from Vanderbilt University School of Medicine. After completing the PhD phase of his training, he returned to medical school and began working with Dr. Philip Corlett on computational models of delusion formation. He recently founded the COPE Project, which he is here to talk about today. Brittany began hearing voices when she was about 15 years old. She experiences these voices as spirit guides. Along with the voices of spirit came an influx of distressing experiences such as anxiety, panic attacks, depression, health paranoia, and suicidality. She didn't know what was happening and didn't know what she was hearing. Brittany self-medicated with substances and alcohol because in those moments, the voices and other uncomfortable sensations were too much for her. Today, 11 years later, she is still a psychic medium and also a therapist at the Prime Clinic, Al's lab manager, and the owner of a healing and spiritual development center. She works alongside Al as co-director of the Spirit Alliance, a consortium of psychic mediums, spiritual communities, therapists, neuroscientists, and people with mental illness to work as a team to understand these perceptual experiences to create better, more person-centered treatments through the COPE Project. Welcome, Al and Brittany. If you haven't subscribed to my newsletter yet, please go to dramyrobbins.com and go ahead and subscribe. Every other week, I send out guided insights called Soul Wisdoms and also give you a little sneak peek as to what's on the show, what you can hear coming up on wherever you get your podcasts, and also what you can join me live on Fireside for. So Fireside is a platform where you can come on, the audience can ask questions and participate in my show. Also, if you haven't had a chance to check out my Patreon page, just go to Patreon and put in my name, Amy Robbins, and you can see the different levels. If you become a subscriber to any of that, then there's little added bonuses that you get at each level, 5, 10, and 20, or whatever you can to support the show. Thank you all for your support and enjoy the show.
Thank you. That was a heck of an intro.
That was great. Yeah. I mean, I don't know if I have anything to add.
Guess we could sign off.
Yeah, well, nice to talk to you guys.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for your time today. So we chatted before, and I'm so excited to chat with you both today. Can you sort of take us through, let's start with Brittany and kind of how this got started, because the title of this podcast is A Medium Walks into a Psychiatrist's Office, but that's sort of what happened.
Exactly what happened. So I'm trying to think where I can pick up from the amazing bio that you just shared. So yes, I'm a voice hearer, and I see all of my perceptual experiences, both with voices and more of the sensory experiences that I have as an empath. So the things that I feel and get overwhelmed with as far as energy goes, all of those things I see as a spiritual experience. And that's something that I really came into as a belief system. I want to say about, how old am I now? It had to have been like over 10 years ago now. And prior to learning about spirituality and that this was even, that energy, for example, was something that you could even connect to, that you could learn about, that you could work with, or that people actually talked about. For me, everything was related to mental health or something wrong with my health. It was a very, I'm feeling this thing, I'm hearing this thing, I'm experiencing this thing. It's my anxiety, it's my depression, it's all my issues. Like, it was always associating it with that. And when I met this woman who I'm still very good friends with today, she really opened my eyes to this whole new world of spirituality. And I thought it was just something really cool that people did in like movies and in like Harry Potter, and that you couldn't actually, talk to dead people or have spirit guides or manifest things. And that was life-changing for me, because it really brought me from this place of seeing my experiences as something bad and that I needed to change, as something that I could embrace and learn about myself and learn about the way that I view the world and learn about how to actually work within those experiences and grow from them. And when I learned these things and my anxiety subsided tremendously, and I had way more control over my experiences. I wasn't, sitting there at work and like freaking out and like, oh, is it a heart attack, or like, is it a brain aneurysm, or like, what am I feeling? What am I hearing? And I gained that control over it. I was like, holy shit. If this is something that I can learn to do and feel well within this framework, how many other people have these experiences and are struggling, and they're on meds and the meds aren't working, or they're in therapy and, the particular, like form of therapy isn't really working for them, or they feel misunderstood, or they feel crazy. How many more people could learn this control or learn these skills like meditation and mindfulness and actually feel well with it and do something with it? And I made it sort of this was my goal now. I want to help people to heal. And so that's what I decided to do. And I opened up my little shop. And while I was there, I decided to get my degree as a therapist. And as any therapist or clinician knows, you need hours and you need experience if you're going to graduate, and
not experience being a medium.
Not experience.
Yeah.
Nope. They had no time for that. Right. Yeah, I needed like actual clinical experience. And just prior to getting my degree and actually even starting school for therapy, I had participated in a study that Al had going on voice hearers, and the difference between people who are, non-clinical voice hearers, which he found us in the spiritual community, and people who have been in the system before because of their voice hearing experiences. And I had never been diagnosed with psychosis. I never even brought up voice hearing to my therapist or my doctor, because I knew damn well what that would mean. I knew I would have this diagnosis potentially, and I wasn't about that. But that's how I had met Al, and quite literally walked into the psychiatrist's office on a locked unit of an inpatient unit. And he interviewed me about my voice hearing experiences. And I remember my friends and family being like, are you going to be able to leave? Right. 'Cause you're going to a psych unit right now and talking about hearing voices.
I let you go though.
He did. And he paid me.
Really?
I did pay. I paid.
And continue to.
Yeah. 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 'Cause once the clinical hours thing came about, my voices actually my guides, as I like to call them, were the ones who were like, you should contact Al Powers. And I was like, who the hell is that? Because I didn't really remember. Sorry, Al. And so I sent him an email and I was like, hey, I don't know if you remember me, but you got anything going on there? And we connected. We went and got donuts and some coffee. And he was like, how about we work on this study together? And I was just like, I'm sorry, what? And the rest is kind of history. I'll let Al.
Yeah. So Al, how does a psychiatrist trained at Vanderbilt working at Yale come to discuss sort of these concepts with your colleagues? I mean, I have a list of other questions about diagnoses and all that, but I'm just really curious how you came into this world, because you weren't hearing spirit guides.
No, I wasn't. I did have my own unusual experiences. I had some hypnagogic hallucinations when I was a teenager, and I always think that, is it a complete accident that I now try to help young people who are having terrifying perceptual experiences? Probably not a complete accident. But was it directly related to this? Probably not. I think the tradition that I'm coming from, and this actually really kind of brought me to psychiatry in the first place, is trying to understand how we perceive the world. This is like where I started. My first love is really trying to understand how we perceive things in general, and like outside of psychiatric illness, just trying to understand. I remember being in the AP psychology class in high school at North Branford High School, go T-Birds, and heard and going to the chapter. I think it was chapter 3 in the textbook about how neurons encoded things like light and sound, and I was like, this is so interesting. Like, you mean the things that I'm seeing, like we know how that works a little bit? Like, we actually know how, that information is somehow brought into the brain. That's really fascinating. And I remember being really struck by that. And my teacher even being somewhat amused by the fact that I was the only one who found this interesting. And then I went to college at Yale, and I remember being just drawn to perceptual neuroscience and trying to understand, again, how we perceive things in general. And that's how I spent my grad school years, and I always thought I was going to be doing something in the brain, because that's what I was interested in, is trying to understand how the brain does stuff, right? And so being someone who had never been in contact with a psychiatrist before, or knew anything at all about psychiatry, I thought I was going to be a neurologist or a neurosurgeon. Actually, I was student interest group in neurology leader at Vanderbilt for 5 years or something like that during my time there, and then I hit surgery and realized very quickly I was not a surgeon. And then very, very quickly thereafter realized I probably wasn't really necessarily a neurologist, but I was going to probably go into neurology anyway, because what else was I going to do? And wasn't even considering psychiatry. I hit the wards at Vanderbilt Psychiatric Hospital, and I was in the psychosis unit. And I was just floored by the fact that, the things I was seeing were things that we could understand using neuroscience. There are things that we could understand about how the brain was processing information in people, and people weren't even necessarily even talking about it that way. But I knew that there was potential. And the reason I wanted to be a physician scientist, why I wanted to be an MD, PhD in the first place, was to be able to take those insights and make a difference in how we actually practice medicine. And it turns out psychiatry was the place where I thought we could best do that. I remember meeting a young man, he was 18 years old, who was on the unit, who had been super popular in high school, was head of the soccer team, or captain of the soccer team, head of his class, tons of friends. And then 2 months before I had seen him on the unit, he started isolating in his room, being extra suspicious of people. And by the time I had seen him, he was fully convinced that everybody he saw was a robot except for himself. Everybody's an imposter. And I remember seeing his dad. Maybe we are. I mean, no one's told me yet. I guess it's hard to test. But when his dad came in, I remember his dad trying to see him, and he wouldn't see his dad because he was convinced that he was an imposter. And it was the most heartbreaking thing. It was the most dramatic medical thing I'd ever seen as a medical student. Just the most life-shattering experience that a person had gone through before my eyes. And
I don't know if this is your experience when I've worked with patients who have psychosis, they draw you into their delusions, and their hallucinations can have the potential to be so powerful, and they are so steadfast in their belief system about it that you're like, wow, like, could it be?
I've definitely had that.
Yeah, of course. I mean, of course. I'm absolutely. And in some ways, trying to understand, we're all trying to understand the world, and we're never certain about those assumptions that we make and the conclusions we draw about the world. And of course, yeah, I try to pride myself in being an open-minded person. But in that case, it was mostly just, I was struck by, how devastating it was for that family. And I wanted to try to make a difference there. And studying perception was one way to do it. This young man was also hearing voices that were telling him everyone was an imposter. And so trying to understand that within the realm of perception, which I just spent like the last 3 or 4 years trying to understand from a brain level, made a lot of sense. And when I came to Yale, back to Yale for residency, and worked with Phil Corlett about delusions, and then moved my kind of expertise in sensory neuroscience into that study, we came up with the experiment that we did together, and trying to understand that from a perspective is normal perception. Trying to understand if we understand perception correctly, which we might not, as you point out, like nobody really knows. But if we understand perception correctly, it's very possible to kind of imagine and understand how you can tweak that system just a little bit and have the same experience that my patients do, or that other people who have unusual experiences, extraordinary experiences do. That itself should be non-stigmatizing. That should be a way of understanding people's experiences across the full breadth of human experience, because we all use the same mechanisms, and we all have the same way of inferring what's around us. And I hope that understanding that from a neuroscience level will allow us to destigmatize those experiences as much as possible.
So how do you differentiate between an auditory hallucination versus voice hearing?
Yeah, so, we should be clear on these terms before I use them, I guess. So auditory hallucinations, traditionally within psychiatry and neuroscience have been, percepts, like things that you perceive in the absence of a corresponding external stimulus. Yeah, it's something that is happening in the outside world causing you to hear that thing. So that in and of itself kind of, implies a certain worldview, right? Like you have to essentially, if nothing is actually out there, that's something that who determines that? But so there's that.
And what is out there?
And what is out there? Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, where is out there? There's all sorts of stuff that's built into that. Right. But that is the traditional kind of definition of auditory hallucination, with the other kind of added components that actually, interestingly enough, there are 3 added components to that. One is that it has no external stimulus, right, that corresponds to it, right? I just mentioned that. The second one is that it has the full force and reality of an actual percept, meaning if I'm hearing someone talk to me, it sounds like someone's talking to me. Like it sounds like almost like it has the full effect of that. And which sometimes can be true, sometimes it can't be true, sometimes not true. And the third one that was added actually in the mid to late 80s by a few people who were trying to differentiate and define hallucinations as best they could. Given the fact that, some people had disorders that were neurologically based and were not necessarily hallucinations, were kind of more illusions and things like that. But the third requirement that I had was that it was outside of voluntary control, that they could not be voluntarily influenced. We don't think those second and third ones are actually true. But that's how auditory hallucinations kind of are traditionally defined. And then voice hearing, is just what it sounds like. It's like without the caveat, without that we have to judge whether something is actually happening outside of you or not, or someone or who has to judge that. It's someone hearing a voice, period. And oftentimes people do, they identify as voice hearers. Brittany just did at the beginning of this interview as someone who hears voices, period. And whether that is from somewhere that, I recognize as being real or not, doesn't matter. It's the experience itself of hearing voices is what matters. And so oftentimes the people we work with identify as voice hearers because it doesn't have within it any judgment about whether it's real or not. It's the experience that is real and the experience that matters. And that's kind of where we're coming from.
And I know you don't study this, but are there other people studying visual hallucinations and clairvoyance? simultaneously?
Totally. Yeah, we do that too, a little bit, actually. We have a visual version of the task that I devised to try to understand the perceptual kind of underpinnings of visual experiences as well. People are interested in that too. I am too. The reason why we focus on auditory is that in psychosis, the most common experience that is often the most distressing and actually does lead to bad clinical outcomes sometimes, like the presence of auditory hallucinations alone increases your risk for suicide, for example, within psychosis. Those are most common and most impactful. So we wanted to start there.
So my question, Brittany, as you were talking, you never told anyone you were hearing voices. Mm-hmm. You never were hospitalized for it. You were medicated. It didn't stop. Is there a difference when you see someone who's medicated for schizophrenia or psychosis, any type of psychosis, versus voice hearing? Like, does the medication work or not work? Is it more effective or less effective? And what implications could that potentially have in terms of like knowing, okay, is this schizophrenia in the way that we have historically thought about it, a brain disorder, versus, I don't know what the versus would be. You could probably tell me what the versus would be, versus someone who has the ability to connect to other energies, the other side, spirit guides, angels, whatever it might be.
Before I answer, I'm probably going to have Al answer more about the med stuff, because that's his world.
That's his wheelhouse.
But I think it's important to know a couple of things about my experience. The first is I was never on an antipsychotic. I was on medication for anxiety and depression, because that's what my doctor diagnosed me with at the time. Mm-hmm. It did not stop any of my experiences from happening. And the other thing is my voices were never problematic for me. Mm-hmm. So they never increased my anxiety, increased my depression, caused me any form of suicidal ideation. For me, my voices were actually life-saving, because when I had suicidal thoughts, my voices were the ones saying like, no, you have like this life to live, you have things to do. And kept me from really feeling alone and like I needed to actually kill myself. Mm-hmm. So I think those things are important to note, because a lot of people we see are distressed by their voices, are on antipsychotics or should be on antipsychotics. And none of that was part of my experience.
Gotcha.
It was always very positive for me.
People who have had positive experiences and are on antipsychotics because they shared that this was happening to them, and so bam, you get prescribed an antipsychotic, you get hospitalized, whatever it is, and then it's actually, once you learn to manage it, can be quite positive.
Yeah, so there are lots of people. Actually, I would say, if I'm understanding the literature correctly, most people who have auditory hallucinations, even in psychosis, have a mixture of positive and negative experiences. In fact, that can sometimes be a barrier to even them wanting to take medications in the first place, because they actually have positive voices too that they don't want to get rid of. And that is something that should be recognized and is under-recognized in the field.
And so when they are medicated, does that quiet the voices typically if you're a voice hearer versus full-blown schizophrenia?
I don't know. So that's a really good question. I would say people with psychosis describe response to antipsychotics being something like, I've heard them describe it as the voices become quieter or sound like they're farther away or can't quite make out what they're saying. Sometimes it's a bad thing, like I said, and sometimes it's a good thing. And they sometimes will say that they're able to ignore them a little more easily. These are kind of common responses to antipsychotics within the context of voice hearing. In terms of people who are non-clinical or non-treatment seeking voice hearers, by definition, they're non-treatment seeking. I don't want to treat them. and because they don't need it. and psychotic medications, as I think they can do a lot of good, and I've seen them do a lot of good. They're not harmless. They're not completely risk-free, and they can do some bad stuff too. And so I have no interest in giving anybody antipsychotics who don't need them. If I had to like do the thought experiment as to whether or not someone would have the same responses to antipsychotics if they were a non-clinical voice hearer, I would say they probably would, based upon what we understand about the neural mechanisms underlying those things. And, when people, for example, who have non-clinical voice hearing experiences get into the MRI scanner and press buttons when they're hearing them, you see very similar brain regions light up as people who have psychosis and voice hearing experiences. Our studies have shown that there's very similar kind of computational underpinnings to those experiences as well. There are some differences, but not all, not many, really, when it comes down to it. So I think I would expect that if you are interacting with the brain in a way that makes you less likely to hear those voices or make them sound like they're farther away and things, I imagine those things would also pertain to non-clinical voice hearers, even though I don't think it's an ethical thing to do.
So the COPE project is about having control over the perceptual experiences. So how do you define versus, you also talk about control over hallucinations and control over perceptual experiences. So you've talked a little bit about how you differentiate those two, but how do you control that?
Yeah, that's like the multi-million-dollar question. Britt, yeah, I'm gonna have you take that one, definitely.
Very good question. This is the thing we're really trying to answer. But based on, I can only really speak from my experience, but we've also interviewed dozens and dozens of people who have these experiences, both who see them from a spiritual lens and people who have been in the psychiatric system and diagnosed with a psychotic disorder, and all of whom have control over their experiences. And it's pretty cool because there's quite an overlap between both communities. You see very similar techniques in both communities to have control over these experiences. But I think first, the most important thing that we hear from everybody, including myself, is normalization. First and foremost, being able to normalize the person's experience. Just because this is happening does not mean you're crazy. It's not the experience itself, but what you make of it and what you do about it. In meeting other people who have these experiences, it could be life-changing to meet a person or multiple people who have experiences similar to yours and see that they're doing well, living their life. And it's like, oh, wow, I can have a normal life if this thing is happening to me, and feel like you have somebody to talk to who is not going to judge you about the experience, but you can just sort of share in that shared experience, is huge. So it's first about like how you set up the appropriate support systems for yourself in having the experience, which is community and normalization. And then the next thing is really engaging with the experience. What is this experience like for you? If you have these voices, what do they want? Talk back. What do they say? Could it have some deeper meaning for an experience that you're having right now? And how to, I like to create meaning with the experiences that I have. And I feel that has really been helpful for a lot of people, including myself. So engagement. Let me think, what else? Personally, I hear a lot about mindfulness and meditation, especially from the spiritual community, grounding, being able to ground oneself and ground oneself in the experience. So you're coming from a more grounded place when you are engaging with the voices or with any experience. Like for me, when I feel stuff, I get like wicked overwhelmed. So it's like, I need to get grounded to really feel out what it is that, I'm experiencing energetically, if you will. Like this morning, totally bugging me out with this eclipse. I'll tell you that right now. I had like a borderline panic attack earlier. So yeah, engagement, normalization, community, groundedness, meditation, mindfulness. And a lot of people use techniques that are more like, let me distract myself and focus on something else, which for me has also been helpful at times. But it's really using a mix of a lot of different techniques, and what works for one person doesn't always work for another. So it's like any type of therapy, really, and therapeutic techniques that you use with people, like what's going to work for you, and then experimenting with it and playing around with it. But I think having the appropriate support in place is huge. And people who are not going to make you feel judged or stigmatized while you're working through it.
Well, and it's so interesting because you all are talking about kind of shutting down the voices, shutting down the connection in some way. And I often have people who reach out to me from the podcast saying, I want to be more connected to the voices, right? I want to be able to connect to spirit guides and loved ones and all of these pieces. Mm-hmm. And it's the same methodology for whichever you're doing in a lot of ways, right? Like you had a spiritually... you had like a spontaneous, this experience for you was spontaneous. You weren't necessarily inviting it in, but now so many more people are wanting to be able to have these experiences, to open themselves up. And I wonder, I'm curious, like what, if the brain in an MRI would look different for that? Would it look the same for people who are trying to control their ability to open up versus it just being spontaneous? Hey, I'm going to come run your lab.
No, I mean, yeah, no, come join us. We love good ideas. Actually, that is an idea that we are actively testing. So we put in a grant just Monday. Nearly killed me. But we put in a grant just Monday, looking at exactly that question. So what is the brain doing when someone is turning their voices on versus off? Like, how is that working? And do you see the same activity patterns that you'd see when someone is just pressing a button, and what parts of the brain are active when they're hearing the voices versus when they're trying to control the voices? And the parts of the brain that we're seeing in a small group of 5 people that we ran, make a lot of sense. Actually, the regions that you're seeing when people are pressing buttons when they're hearing voices in the context of these unusual experiences, who are non-clinical voice hearers, look exactly like the ones that you would expect to light up when you look at voice hearing in general. And the areas that are involved in turning the voices off are involved in general kind of cognitive control. These are like areas like dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, which is involved in like executive control and executive function, like kind of making sure that you keep things kind of in order and planned and things, and inhibited when you need to inhibit. So those are areas that kind of make sense with regard to controlling voice hearing. But I want to say too also that, you might have gotten this from what Brittany just said about her experiences, but control is we have a love-hate relationship with the word control, because I think it makes sense to a lot of people, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to some other people, and particularly people who have lived experience, because in a lot of ways it's about the relationship. Mm-hmm. And it's about developing a relationship with your voices and engaging with them in such a way that that you can draw boundaries that are kind of, I guess, for want of a better word, mutually beneficial. That you can that you trust that the voices are going to not like bother you when you're having a podcast interview. That that they're not going to bug you when you're trying to do your schoolwork or do your job or take care of your kids. And so those are the kinds of things that people really describe. And so the process for developing that relationship and engaging with the voices in such a way that they will respect those boundaries is, I think, the crux of the matter, and trying to really understand how that happens is part of the work that we're trying to do for the next probably a couple of decades. So, yeah.
So it's so amazing that it even started. So when you hear someone like Brittanys say she hears voices and they're spirit guides, in your mind conceptually, what does that mean to you?
To me, what that means is that I have an extremely talented lab manager. No, I mean, I think for me, what that means is that she's here having experience. She's hearing she's hearing her guides. I mean, like, I take that literally at face value, that is what she's hearing, and that she's interpreting that in a way that means that she's that means something particular to her. It doesn't mean that she's distressed by that. It doesn't mean that she's that's causing her any dysfunction. In fact, actually, it led her to me, so I'm quite grateful for that experience. So in general, divorcing the experience itself from the way that it impacts someone's life is an important thing to do. And divorcing that experience and accepting that the voices are real, like the experiences themselves are real, which is a saying that our colleagues in the Hearing Voices movement say all the time. The voices are real because, they deserve to be taken seriously as real human experiences, as real as anybody else's. And the impact of those experiences is what really matters. How much it's disrupting, your life. If you come to me and you have voices that are disrupting your life, I'm going to want to help you, but not otherwise.
What are your colleagues saying about this work?
I don't know. I think in general, they're very supportive. In general, Yale is like, I think we're privileged in a lot of ways. And one privilege is that we're at Yale. And it's a wonderful psychiatry department. It has a great tradition of doing science that is, very scientifically based, very biologically oriented psychiatry in general. And we come at it from a very biological orientation. And so I think in that way, we haven't, gotten all that much flack about it. But in addition to that, we come from a tradition here where people kind of try to really critically think about the role of psychiatry in people's lives and our patients' lives. There's a whole wing of the psychiatry department here at Yale who called the it's headed by a number of people over at the Community Engagement Center, but they're part of the critical psychiatry movement, where they are interested in trying to understand, how psychiatry has done not just good but a lot of harm over the course of years. And this is a whole wing of the psychiatry department.
Wow.
And so what we're trying to understand really is how to make the field better, and that comes from all sorts of different angles. And we have people who have been, very supportive of our work. Some people have kind of looked a little bit more askance at it, but I think in general, we've gotten a lot of support, and gotten a lot of support from our department chair, John Crystal, and from, others in terms of funding agencies. I think it's important work.
Well, and there's clearly money available. I mean, if you're writing grants for it, there's money out there that people are curious about this.
Yeah, I think so. We'll find out if it gets funded, but yeah, it's, I think in general, people are interested and curious. The idea, this is actually, building upon years and years and years and years and years of work that's been done by epidemiologists in Europe, for example. A guy named Jim Van Oss first came up with the idea that, psychosis is not just like all or none kind of like, binary phenomenon. There's a spectrum. There's a spectrum of experiences across the whole population. And that's led to work that is now generally accepted, that there are a lot of people walking around the general population. About 13% of the general population has psychotic-like experiences. What does that even mean when it comes to understanding and diagnosing psychosis? It means that we need to expand our definition of psychosis and expand our definition of what is possible in human experience. That's what it means.
That was one of my questions, was, do you think that we're going to eventually move towards the DSM, which is the Diagnostic and
Statistical Manual, yeah.
Statistical Manual of Disorders, that we all use to kind of talk to each other about, this person's schizophrenic, or, they're depressed, right? It's a list of symptoms that help us communicate with each other. I always think it's nothing more than that, frankly, because we all come to each experience with our own experiences, right?
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
So do you think that eventually this disorder, and possibly all of them in some regards, end up moving towards more of a spectrum-like disorder, like autism or something, which is now on a spectrum?
Yes. I mean, I think that's absolutely true. If you'll indulge me, a small story. So there's a colleague of mine, a mentor really, here at Yale, who is Godfrey Perlson, who is this great guy. He's been around forever and has done some really great work, particularly on the spectrum of psychotic disorders. And he has this great analogy. And the way he usually says it is this. There used to be this disease called dropsy. Brittanys heard this like 10 times more, probably 100 maybe. There used to be this disease called dropsy. Maybe 200. Have you heard of dropsy before?
Have I?
Yeah.
I feel like this is a joke.
No, not a joke. I promise. Not a joke. This is true. Okay. This is like a state-of-the-art medicine, turn of the 20th century. So there used to be a disease called dropsy. There's a reason you hadn't heard of it. Here's how you would get dropsy. Is you would go into the doctor's office and you would have these certain set of symptoms. You would have swollen ankles. You would have a hard time breathing. It'd be difficult for you to get around. You'd cough up some stuff, and the doctor would look at you and say, well, it sounds like it's probably dropsy. You met with these 3 criteria. I'm going to give you this medication that we know some people with dropsy respond to. It's called foxglove. It's a foxglove extract. It's from this plant, foxglove. And 30% of people will respond to foxglove if you have dropsy. And so people would take it, and 30% of people will respond to it, and that's pretty much where they were at. That was the state of the art in terms of internal medicine in 1910. And but as people started learning more and more about how the different body systems can break down to give you dropsy, which is really just fluid overload, like too much fluid in your body. Turns out you can get dropsy from like kidney failure, you can get it from heart failure, you can get it from pulmonary failure, you can get it from liver failure, from a bunch of different organ systems that are breaking down. And the interesting thing about this is that the people who responded to foxglove were the ones who had congestive heart failure. They were the ones who, so foxglove is the basis of digitalis, which is a medication that makes your heart pump better. And so by understanding how you got to that point, how you got to having dropsy in the first place, made people realize that, well, you know what, actually dropsy doesn't exist. As an entity, it does not exist. What it is a final collection of symptoms that are arrived at because of a bunch of different pathways. And schizophrenia is dropsy. It doesn't exist. Not as a singular entity. It is a final set of symptoms that is arrived at by systems in the brain that we don't quite understand yet in terms of how they're breaking down. And auditory hallucinations are maybe sometimes part of that, in combination with other deficits that can cause dysfunction and can be compensated for. So I think what we're eventually going to be moving toward is understanding, just as we have for the rest of the body, the ways that the brain can kind of be altered to give you that final set of symptoms, and we can intervene specifically to address those kind of those root causes.
So you look at it very much from like a brain perspective, but how do you think that it could open us up to expansiveness of consciousness or understanding consciousness in this way? Because is what Brittany experiences more of an expansion of consciousness versus someone with a diagnosis of schizophrenia and any psychotic disorder, brain disorder?
Why are those different?
Because they've been, this whole episode is.
No, really. I mean, like, so, I don't.
Well, I guess that gets into like what is the brain and what constitutes the brain versus what constitutes the mind.
Yeah, absolutely. It gets into all sorts of philosophy of mind kind of questions. But when it comes down to it, I don't see any. I don't see any reason to think that all of human experience can't be understood through the brain. And I don't understand necessarily how an expansion of consciousness wouldn't be housed necessarily through the brain either, or not necessarily through the brain itself, but through like the way the brain processes information. And so it's yeah. So I mean, I think that they might be the same thing. Whether that makes it less magical or not, I don't know. I don't think so. I'm inclined to think it's a pretty damn magical process in general, whether it's housed in the brain or not.
Right.
And
I mean, the brain is pretty magical.
It's wild.
Yeah.
Yeah. So.
And we don't know so much about how it works even.
That's true. Yes, very true.
So the last thing, I pulled this out of one of your papers, which is that I thought this was really interesting, that participants who developed a spiritual explanatory framework were more likely to exert control over the voice hearing experiences than those that developed a pathologizing framework. Importantly, despite clear differences in this explanatory framework and distress because of their experiences, both groups underwent similar trajectories to develop control and acceptance over their voice hearing experiences. Understanding these factors will be critical in transforming control over voice hearing experiences from a phenomenological observation to an actionable route for clinical intervention. So, translation, how do we help people maybe see these experiences as spiritual opportunities for growth?
That's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think the observation that sentence kind of comes from is that, people who interpreted those experiences spiritually did better, right? And one question that even before we get toward intervention is why? Why is that the case? Like, why is that believing that you're hearing from your guides is better than thinking that you're hearing from the devil or from the FBI or something else that might cause you dysfunction? And I think inherent in that sentence is the answer, which is that, it's much easier to kind of approach and negotiate with and develop a relationship with your guides than it is with the devil or with the FBI who's trying to harm you. I think those beliefs themselves allow you to engage with and go through the process of developing some agency over those experiences. They allow you to kind of get control of them with these common mechanisms that we just talked about. That people with clinical and non-clinical voice hearing experiences kind of go through in common. And that is based in engagement. And so the question is, how do we translate that? Not necessarily with saying like, hey, you are having a spiritual experience. And so therefore, you're going to go ahead and do better. Like, you learn that this is actually spiritual. That's not really, I don't think, where we're going to go. What I think it's going to be is that you are going to have a way to engage with the voices in some way, or with those experiences, or maybe even, with the idea of having voices in a way that is not threatening and allows you to go through that process of growth and negotiation. That's where I would see it going. But yeah,
and
sorry,
just to add,
yep.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No.
I think it's less about seeing it as whether or not it's spiritual, and then seeing it from a framework that's going to be empowering. Like, if you're feeling like the devil is talking to you all the time, you're going to feel like you have power over that. Or if like the FBI is out to get you and going to harm you, like, dude, they got way more power than us. Like, you're not going to feel empowered in that framework. Totally. So I think as far as developing a treatment goes, it's more about finding what's going to empower people. And for a lot of people, that can be spirituality. But then we also want to take into consideration, like, there's a lot of people who aren't spiritual out there who have these experiences. Absolutely. And we can't force spirituality on them. No. So I think it's more about empowerment and what's going to make somebody feel good and strong and capable and normal and know that they're just experiencing being a fucking human, which is really hard in general, than it is about saying like, this is spirit or this is your consciousness, like opening up, because some people aren't going to be down with that. And they're going to be like, that's not my thing.
Well, and I think it's, what you said, what I read could be applied to any clinical diagnosis. Right? It's like how you view the experience of it.
Absolutely.
Shifts how you respond to it.
That's absolutely true.
It's how we view being human and how we view like any experience we have as a person. If you're dating someone and they cheat on you and you see this as like, I can never trust anybody again. My life is over. Right. Screw
this always
people.
Happens to me.
This always happens to me.
Every time I'm in a relationship.
You're never going to date. But if you see it as like, oh, sweet, move that one out the way. Glad I figured this one out right now. And you're approaching it from a more positive or neutral place, you can move through a human experience, relationships, a lot more healthfully. Is that a word, healthfully?
Sure.
So I think it applies to everything
all the time. So we're all good.
It's a way to be. But yeah, I think it's something we can apply to every experience as a human. And it's something that we need to do in mental health in general, is to humanize these experiences a little more.
So if people want to hear, I'm going to open it up for questions because we're on Fireside. So if anybody who is in the audience, which is very small today, wants to ask a question, that would be Mark. Please raise your hand. Come on, Mark.
Hey, Mark.
But in the meantime, can you let us know where people can learn about the work you're doing? Because you do you do take participants for this work.
Yes.
Absolutely. Yeah. It is, if you just Google the Yale COPE Project, COPE Project, you'll find our webpage, which is spirit.research.yale.edu.
There you go.
But even if you just Google Yale COPE, that's probably honestly, I actually have to do that every time. So,
right. So just Google the Yale COPE Project.
That's right.
COPE, not K.
Yes.
And it stands for Control Over Perceptual Experiences, right?
That's right.
Yes.
That's right.
And we're pretty reachable and approachable. So even if you don't want to participate, you can hit us up anytime. We're always down to have a good conversation.
Absolutely. I mean, we get so many emails all the time. We're more, and we love it. I mean, I love hearing from people. So yeah, anytime. It's albert.powers@yale.edu. Please.
Yeah, and you both are phenomenal. Like, this is the second time we've talked. I'm like trying to come up with why I can have a third time to talk to you both.
We love it. I mean, you don't need an excuse. We'd be happy to do it. So.
Love.
Next time, let's do a seance with Al.
That sounds great.
We could totally maybe I'll do like an ongoing once a month fireside chat once this gets up and running, called Seances with Al.
That sounds great.
Oh, that's amazing.
I'm totally into that. That sounds awesome. I would love it. Okay,
we're revisiting this, Brittany.
Yes, we are.
Thank Mark, or anybody else in the audience, which is Mark. If you have a question, raise your hand. Otherwise, thank you both, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you. This is wonderful.
Like what you heard today and want to hear more? Wondering what comes next and what it all means? Head over to Apple Podcast, Spotify, Stitcher, Google Play, or anywhere you get your podcasts and hit subscribe. Also, if you could take a minute to rate and review my podcast, I would really appreciate it. Stay tuned as we continue to explore life, death, and the space between.